In the Vatican archives, locked away for centuries, there's a diary entry that the Catholic Church wishes didn't exist. October 30th, 1501. The papal master of ceremonies writes about watching 50 prostitutes stripped naked in the apostolic palace. He describes candelabras placed on the floor, chestnuts scattered everywhere, the women crawling on hands and knees to collect them while cardinals watched. Then something worse, a sexual endurance contest, with the Pope himself awarding prizes for whoever could perform the most. This wasn't written by enemies of the Church. This was recorded by Johann Burchard, the Pope's own master of ceremonies, a man whose job was to document Vatican events. And what he documented that night has haunted the Catholic Church for 500 years. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. This wasn't even the worst thing this Pope did. The orgies were just the tip of the iceberg. This was a man who acknowledged 9 illegitimate children while wearing the papal crown, who lived openly with a 20-year-old mistress in the sacred halls where he said Mass, who had his own son-in-law strangled in his bed, who literally bought the papacy with cartloads of silver, turning the throne of St. Peter into something unrecognizable. For over a decade, from 1492 to 1503, one man transformed the holiest office in Christianity into his personal kingdom of flesh and corruption. And the Catholic Church has been trying to make you forget his name ever since. That man was Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. And what I'm about to show you isn't anti-Catholic propaganda. It's documented history from the Church's own records. Let me take you inside the most depraved papacy in history. Rodrigo Borgia didn't start as a monster. Born in 1431 near Valencia, Spain, he was groomed from childhood for a church career. But here's where the corruption begins. His uncle, Cardinal Alonso de Borja, became Pope Calixtus III in 1455. And what's the first thing Uncle Pope does? He makes 25-year-old Rodrigo a cardinal, not because of holiness or theological brilliance, but because of blood. By age 26, Rodrigo held one of the most powerful positions in the Vatican, Vice-Chancellor, essentially the Pope's chief operating officer. For the next 35 years, while popes came and went, Rodrigo Borgia accumulated wealth, connections, and secrets. But Rodrigo had a problem: women. Contemporary accounts describe him as devastatingly handsome, with what one observer called a magnetism that drew women more powerfully than iron is drawn to a magnet. Even as a young cardinal, his sexual exploits raised eyebrows. In 1460, Pope Pius II had to write him a scathing letter. Rodrigo had hosted a party in Siena where, according to the Pope's informants, there were immodest dances and numerous women present with husbands locked outside. Pius wrote that Rodrigo behaved as though you were one of the most vulgar young men. The Pope warned that such behaviour gives a pretext to those who accuse us of using our office for orgies. Think about that for a moment. A Pope had to tell his cardinal to stop throwing sex parties because it was making the church look bad. And what did Rodrigo do? He kept the parties quieter, but he didn't stop. By the 1470s, he'd settled into a long-term relationship with Vanozza de Catane, an Italian noblewoman. She wasn't his wife. He was a cardinal, supposedly celibate. But she bore him 4 children: Cesare in 1475, Juan in 1476, Lucrezia in 1480, and Joffre in 1481. And here's the shocking part. Rodrigo didn't hide them. He acknowledged these children publicly. He even got papal bulls to legitimize them. A cardinal with an open family. It was unprecedented. Now you might think this would disqualify him from becoming pope. You'd be wrong. Because when Pope Innocent VIII died in July 1492, Rodrigo Borgia had something more powerful than piety. He had money, lots of it, and he was willing to use every ducat to buy the papal throne. The conclave of 1492 became the most corrupt papal election in history. Rodrigo didn't just bribe a few cardinals, he bought them wholesale. To Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, he sent 4 mule loads of silver. Not metaphorically, actual mules carrying actual silver through the streets of Rome to Sforza's palace. In exchange, Sforza would deliver his faction's votes and become the new vice-chancellor, with an income of 10,000 ducats a year. To the Orsini family cardinals, he promised estates and castles. To Cardinal Pallavicini, the fortress of Civita Castellana. Every vote had a price, and Rodrigo paid it. When Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici realised what was happening, he warned, "Now we're in the power of a wolf, the most rapacious that this world has ever seen, and if we do not flee, he will inevitably devour us all. But it was too late. On August 11th, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. He'd literally purchased the throne of St. Peter. The reaction in Rome was mixed. Common people celebrated. They were tired of the weak and corrupt Innocent VIII, but those who understood what had just happened were horrified. The reformist preacher Girolamo Savonarola immediately declared the election invalid, calling Alexander a broken tool chosen through simony. Within years, Savonarola would burn at the stake for his opposition. That's what happened to those who challenged the Borgia Pope, but Alexander's first acts as Pope revealed his true priorities. Within weeks, he made his teenage son Cesare a cardinal. Canon law prohibited this. Cardinals were supposed to be legitimate, celibate, and qualified. Cesare was none of these things. He was 18, illegitimate, and more interested in warfare than theology. But he was a Borgia, and that's all that mattered. Over the next few years, Alexander would appoint at least 10 of his relatives as cardinals. He created 19 new Spanish cardinals total, flooding the College of Cardinals with his countrymen and kinsmen. This sacred institution that elected popes had become a Borgia family business. The nepotism was shameless. His son Juan became Duke of Gandia and commander of the papal armies. His son Joffre, at 13 years old, married a princess of Naples and became Prince of Squillace. His daughter Lucrezia. We'll get to her marriages in a moment, because each one was a scandal in itself. Even distant cousins and the relatives of his mistresses got positions. Alessandro Farnese, the brother of his current mistress, became a cardinal. That same Alessandro would later become Pope Paul III, meaning the Borgia corruption infected the papacy for generations. But let's talk about those mistresses, because this is where Pope Alexander VI crossed every conceivable line of decency. After becoming Pope, a 60-year-old man with the highest spiritual office in Christendom, Alexander took a new lover, Giulia Farnese. She was 20 years old, stunningly beautiful and married. The Romans called her Giulia la Bella, Giulia the Beautiful. But here's the truly shocking part. She didn't just visit the Pope secretly. She lived in the Vatican, in the papal apartments, the Pope's teenage mistress residing in the Holy of Holies. How did Alexander manage this? He bought off Giulia's husband, Orsino Orsini, gave him castles, estates, lucrative positions, essentially paying the man to let the Pope sleep with his wife. Contemporary ambassadors wrote dispatches about seeing Giulia at papal ceremonies sitting near the Pope's throne. In 1494, she gave birth to a daughter, Laura. The official father was listed as unknown, but everyone knew. The Pope had fathered a child while in office, with his mistress living openly in the Vatican. The Roman diarist Stefano Infessura wrote, "There is no longer any crime or shameful act that does not take place in the home of the pontiff. Even in Renaissance Rome, where corruption was commonplace, people were appalled. But Alexander didn't care. He was beyond shame." Now remember those 4 children with the Nozze dei Catane? As Pope, Alexander didn't distance himself from them. He brought them into the centre of his world. Cesare and Lucrezia became his primary political instruments. And this is where the sexual scandals become entangled with political murder. Because the Borgias didn't just break moral laws, they eliminated anyone who stood in their way. Let me tell you about Lucrezia's marriages, because they reveal the depths of Alexander's depravity. Her first marriage in 1493 was to Giovanni Sforza, connecting the Borgias to the powerful Sforza family of Milan. Lucrezia was 13, but by 1497 the political winds had shifted. The Sforza alliance was no longer useful, so Alexander annulled the marriage. The grounds? He claimed Giovanni Sforza was impotent and the marriage was never consummated. Giovanni Sforza, humiliated and furious, made a shocking accusation. He said the Pope wanted the marriage annulled not for political reasons, but because Alexander wanted his daughter for himself. That the Pope was committing incest with Lucrezia. He also claimed Cesare was sleeping with his sister. Now, historians today generally believe these were vengeful lies from a humiliated man. But the fact that such accusations were immediately believed by many tells you how low the Pope's reputation had already sunk. During the annulment proceedings, something curious happened. Lucrezia was sent to a convent supposedly to pray, but rumours spread that she was pregnant. In early 1498, a baby boy appeared in the Borgia household. The Romans called him the Infans Romanus, the Roman infant. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. Alexander issued 2 papal bulls about this child's parentage. The first, public bull stated the boy was Cesare's illegitimate son, but a second, secret bull issued the same day claimed the child was Alexander's own son. Why two different stories? Some historians believe the child was indeed Lucrezia's, fathered by a young lover named Pedro Calderon. Calderon was found dead in the Tiber River shortly after, almost certainly murdered on Cesare's orders. The double bulls were Alexander's way of legitimizing the child while maintaining some deniability about its true parentage. Lucrezia's second marriage was to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, in 1498. This allied the Borgias with Naples. Alfonso was handsome, young, and by all accounts, Lucrezia actually loved him. They had a son together, but love meant nothing in the Borgia world. By 1500, Alexander and Cesare had shifted their alliance from Naples to France. Alfonso became inconvenient. On July 15th, 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's. He survived the stabbing, recuperating in the Vatican itself. But on August 18th, while recovering, he was strangled in his bed. Cesare Borgia later boasted that he had ordered the murder. The Pope's son murdered the Pope's son-in-law in the Vatican itself, and Alexander, he told Lucrezia to stop crying and arranged her third marriage. This pattern, marriage, murder, remarriage, was the Borgia way. But the sexual scandals went far beyond political marriages. Let's talk about what happened on October 30th, 1501, the Banquet of Chestnuts. This isn't rumour or propaganda. This comes from the diary of Johann Burchard, the Pope's Master of Ceremonies, a typically staid and reliable observer. According to Burchard, Pope Alexander VI hosted a dinner in the Papal Palace. Present were Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia, and various cardinals and nobles. After dinner, 50 courtesans, high-class prostitutes, were brought in. They danced, first clothed, then naked. Candelabras were placed on the floor, and chestnuts were scattered around them. The naked women crawled on hands and knees to collect the chestnuts, while the Pope and his family watched. Then, Burchard writes, the guests paired off with the courtesans for a sex contest. The Pope offered prizes, silk tunics, shoes, jewellery, to the men who could perform the act most often with the courtesans. Let that sink in. The Pope, the spiritual leader of Western Christianity, the man who claimed to hold the keys to heaven and hell, was judging a sexual endurance contest in the Vatican, with his children present, encouraging orgies in the same palace where he celebrated Mass. Some modern historians have questioned whether the Banquet of Chestnuts really happened exactly as Burchard described. Maybe he exaggerated. Maybe he misunderstood. But Burchard wasn't given to wild tales. His diary is generally matter-of-fact, even boring. If he wrote it, he believed it happened. And given everything else we know about Alexander VI, is it really so hard to believe? The corruption wasn't limited to sex. Alexander sold everything. Church offices, indulgences, annulments, legitimizations, even justice itself. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the Pope sells everything for money, even justice. Want to be a cardinal? That'll be 25,000 ducats. Need your bastard child legitimized? Make an offer. Want your enemy excommunicated? Let's negotiate. The Vatican had become a marketplace where salvation was for sale. He used this money to fund Cesare's military campaigns. Between 1499 and 1503, Cesare conquered much of central Italy, creating a Borgia state. The campaigns were brutal. When the city of Capua resisted, Cesare's troops killed 6,000 citizens in a single day. The Pope celebrated these victories as expanding papal power, but everyone knew the truth. He was building a kingdom for his family. Throughout all of this, the sexual excesses continued. Courtesans came and went from the Vatican so frequently that Romans joked about it being a brothel. The Pope's banker, Agostino Chigi, hosted parties where naked women served food to cardinals. The papal court became synonymous with debauchery. Foreign ambassadors wrote shocked reports home. The French ambassador noted that young women are admitted at all hours of the day to the Pope's chambers. But here's what makes Alexander VI particularly shocking. He didn't even pretend to hide it. Previous popes who broke their vows at least maintained a facade of propriety. Alexander flaunted his children, his mistresses, his greed. When criticised, he didn't repent. He had the critics killed or exiled. Cardinal della Rovere fled to France to escape assassination. Savonarola was burned at the stake. The Orsini and Colonna families were systematically destroyed, their lands confiscated and given to Borgias. The murder of one Borgia in 1497 reveals the depths of Borgia family dysfunction. One was Alexander's favourite son, Duke of Gandia, young and handsome. On June 14th, he disappeared after leaving a party. His body was found in the Tiber River, stabbed 9 times. Alexander was devastated, weeping for days, briefly even considering reform. But who killed Juan? Many suspected Cesare, his own brother, motivated by jealousy and ambition. The Pope seems to have suspected this too, but did nothing. Within a year, Cesare had left the cardinalate and taken Juan's place as the family's military leader. Fratricide was just another political tool in the Borgia arsenal. By 1503, the Borgias seemed unstoppable. Alexander was 72 but still vigorous, still scheming. Cesare controlled much of central Italy. Lucrezia was married into the powerful Este family of Ferrara. The papacy had been transformed into a hereditary monarchy, with plans for Cesare to eventually succeed his father. Then, suddenly it ended. In August 1503, both Alexander and Cesare fell violently ill after dining at a villa outside Rome. For days, the Pope suffered from fever and vomiting. On August 18th, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. Immediately, rumours spread that the Borgias had been poisoned by their own poison, that they'd accidentally drunk wine intended for their host, Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. It was poetic justice. The poisoners poisoned. Modern historians believe Alexander probably died of malaria, which was common in the Roman summer. But the poison story was instantly believed because it fit perfectly with the Borgia reputation. These were people who used poison so frequently that everyone assumed they'd eventually poison themselves. Alexander's death brought immediate chaos. Cesare, still ill, couldn't hold his conquests. The new pope, Julius II, was Alexander's enemy and systematically destroyed Borgia power. Within months, everything Alexander had built collapsed. Cesare died in exile in 1507, killed in a minor skirmish in Spain. Lucrezia, surprisingly, reformed herself, becoming a respected duchess in Ferrara, patron of the arts, dying peacefully in 1519. She spent her later years trying to live down her family name. The contrast between Alexander's death and a normal papal death was stark. When popes die, their bodies are supposed to be venerated, displayed for the faithful. Alexander's body reportedly turned black and swelled so grotesquely that it could barely fit in the coffin. It decomposed with unusual speed, filling St. Peter's with a terrible stench. The Romans saw this as a sign of divine judgment. The devil had come to collect his own. Here's what's truly terrifying about Alexander VI. He wasn't an anomaly. He was the logical endpoint of what happens when religious authority becomes purely political power, when the church stopped being about faith and became about wealth and control. Other Renaissance popes were corrupt, but Alexander took it to its ultimate conclusion. He proved that with enough money and ruthlessness, you could buy and sell salvation itself. The reformer Martin Luther was just 13 when Alexander died, but the Borgia papacy became central to his later critique of the Catholic Church. How could the Church claim moral authority when it had been led by such a man? The Protestant Reformation, which split Western Christianity, was partly a reaction to the excesses Alexander embodied. He became the cautionary tale, the proof that the Church needed fundamental reform. Even within Catholicism, Alexander's legacy was one of shame and reform. The Council of Trent, which reshaped the Catholic Church in response to Protestantism, specifically targeted the abuses Alexander represented: simony, nepotism, clerical incontinence. Rules were tightened, celibacy was enforced more strictly, the sale of offices was forbidden. The Church was trying to ensure there would never be another Alexander VI. But here's the darkest truth: it almost worked. If Alexander had lived another decade, if Cesare had been a bit luckier, the Borgias might have turned the papacy into their hereditary kingdom. Central Italy would have become a Borgia dynasty. The spiritual authority of the Church would have become merely a tool for Borgia ambitions. Christianity itself would have been fundamentally altered. What saved the Church wasn't divine intervention. It was simple biology, disease, age, mortality. The institution survived, but the scars remained. To this day, no pope has taken the name Alexander VII, VIII, or IX. The name is too tainted. When people say Borgia, They don't think of theological contributions or charitable works. They think of poison, incest, and murder. In the Vatican today, you can still visit the Borgia apartments, where Alexander lived and ruled. The beautiful frescoes painted by Pinturicchio remain, showing mythological and biblical scenes. But for centuries after Alexander's death, these rooms were sealed. Later popes couldn't bear to use spaces so associated with corruption. Julius II refused to live where Alexander had lived, commissioning new apartments, the ones decorated by Raphael that tourists visit today. It was easier to build new rooms than to cleanse the old ones of their memories. The Catholic Church's official position on Alexander VI is telling. They don't deny the corruption, the mistresses, the nepotism. The Catholic Encyclopedia admits he sadly neglected the spiritual interests of the Church. That's Vatican speak, for he was a complete disaster. Unlike other controversial popes who've been somewhat rehabilitated by history, Alexander remains condemned. He's the pope the Church wishes it could forget. What makes Alexander VI particularly relevant today is how he achieved and maintained power. He understood that institutions are only as strong as the people who run them, that with enough money and blackmail, any system can be corrupted, that people will accept almost anything if it's normalised slowly enough. First, a cardinal has mistresses, shocking but not unprecedented. Then he has children, unusual but tolerable. Then he becomes pope and brings his children to court, concerning, but what can you do? Then, orgies in the Vatican. By that point, people were too compromised or frightened to object. This is how corruption works, not all at once but step by step, each transgression making the next seem less shocking. Alexander VI didn't start by hosting orgies in the papal palace. He worked up to it over decades, gradually expanding what was possible, what was acceptable. By the time he was judging sex contests in the Vatican, the institution was so corrupted that no one could stop him. The story of Alexander VI forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power and human nature. If the Pope, surrounded by religious imagery, constant prayer, and theological study, could become so corrupt, what does that say about the rest of us?